So you might have noticed that we've called webinar today and the next three that are coming in this little mini series that we're running masterclasses. And that's because we're wanting to do something that goes beyond what should we do and a bit more into the how should we do it. So the content in these sessions will move from the sort of principles that we're talking about a bit more into demonstrations and discussion that hopefully you will find helpful in helping you to tackle some of these areas yourself and to understand some of the tools and approaches that might help you. As ever, we really want this to be an engaging, two-way participatory conversation. So as questions occur to you, and they will occur to you, please do stick them in the chat. And then I can facilitate some Q&A later on in our time together and make sure that those questions get raised with our presenters. If I just paint a little bit of context then on this session. So with this one is a masterclass about active travel insight. And at the end of the year, I wrote a blog piece with some reflections about some changes in the way that funding had been announced for active travel. So some of you will be aware of the £39 million worth of capability fund that got announced through Active Travel England. And I think quite a sort of focus on that active travel emerging across authorities, because there's more funding there than there has been for issues around safety, for example. But as certainly some of the work I've been engaged with, working with authorities, looking at their sort of strategic objectives for the transport system, I think we need a slightly sort of more grown-up conversation about the ways in which some of these areas can integrate and we can deliver more value for citizens, more value from the limited amount of resource that's available there across a number of areas. So engaging in the way that transport and health policy in particular to support wider policy goals, thinking about things like climate change, air quality, community cohesion, and an aging population. And hopefully some of the stuff that you'll see in our webinar today will help you not only to think about perhaps the sort of very specifics of how you might do things in your job, your role better, but actually will start to help you to make connections with some wider areas of policy that your authorities are working on, thinking about ways in which actually you could be delivering more bang for that pay a buck, particularly by thinking about more integrated approaches where data becomes something of a common language to bring people together and say, how do you make the system work better for all? So I'm not going to talk anymore. Great to have you all with us. What I'm going to do is hand over to my colleagues, Richard, Owen, and to Suzanne, and they are going to take us through the material. And as I say, please do start putting your comments in the chat, raising your questions, because we really would like to hear from you through this and to facilitate some good discussion as we go forward. So, Richard, why don't you take it away?
Thank you, Dan. Yeah, I think it'd be great if you put a link to that blog that you wrote actually in the meeting chat here, because it's a really good read. And I really like to follow on a little bit from some of your thoughts in there about the links between road safety and active travel, and specifically how people around the world, I guess, are having a look at that, because things do seem to be changing quite a lot. Now, whether it's all pandemic related or whether it's because we in road safety are realizing that we're linked so much more with other transport areas, I'm not quite sure. But there's some really good examples out there of active travel and road safety aligning at a policy level. This is certainly something we're finding out. We spend a lot of time speaking to Vision Zero partnerships that are popping up around the country a lot at the moment, and they're very much looking at the the two, co-policy objectives at the same time. And it's actually a really easy one because there's a lot of overlap in there, and there's a lot of overlap in the data, of course, and you'd expect me to talk about that, and I'm going to show some examples of that quite soon. There's also been a bit of a shift as well in terms of the focus on safe infrastructure. So we've been concerned about infrastructure and infrastructure safety for some time, but there's also been a historical interest in collision history and collision profiles. So understanding historic risk on roads is absolutely still relevant, but thinking about what kind of safe infrastructure authorities want to be putting in place is really front and center. And that's not just about safe infrastructure. It's about the kind of infrastructure that's put in place to promote cycling, because that's one of the key goals here. We know that we can get more people cycling, then there's so many other health benefits that are associated with that, and benefits for carbon reduction. There's lots of other areas that can benefit from this, but in order to do that, you need to get people cycling, and in order to get people cycling, they need to feel safe. So it's really interesting, this risk, danger, feeling of safety debate that's happening at the moment. Now, I've talked about whether this is in the UK or overseas, but there's some really good new tools that have been available in the UK, and some that are being developed internationally, especially around the link with cycling. And I'm going to show you an example of those in a moment. And yeah, I've talked about that collision data, and it always will be relevant. I've spent nearly 20 years now analysing collision data, and having good quality access to evidence about where the threats are on the roads is absolutely critical. But this understanding of road danger reduction and what that means to us in road safety and in active travel is really critical too. So I'm going to show you some examples first of all. So this is one of my favorite figures that have been published in a government document in the last few years. It's the one that I can definitely remember the number for, so figure 4.1. So this comes from LTN 120. So this is the guidance document for local authorities about cycling and walking and improving infrastructure to help people move around the streets safely and in an active manner. So hopefully you can see there that we've got a simple matrix here. And what I really like about it is it uses some transport data that I'm familiar with, and I know that a lot of people that work in safety are familiar with there. So we've got some speed limit information on the left hand side. So that could be, they put speed limit in there, you could have put in average speeds or 85th percentiles. We're used to measuring speed because that's so critical in safe system, of course, and which is why it's great to see this reflected in an active travel document. Then we've got traffic flow. So we know that traffic flow is critical as well. And when you add those two things together, speed and traffic flow, and then look at the types of infrastructure available for cycling, you can start to see where not only the risks are, but where the opportunities are to improve people's attitudes towards cycling. So this is a tool that's about identifying the appropriate level of protection, but it's also framed in a way of saying that if you provide the appropriate protection to people, then that's going to encourage them to use that kind of infrastructure. So, as you'd expect, wherever you've got low speeds and you've got low traffic flows, the requirement for, dedicated infrastructure really isn't in place. When you've got road volumes that are, well below 5,000 per day and definitely below 2,000, as long as you've got reasonably low speeds, around 20 miles an hour, which of course are very prevalent around the UK at the moment, you can have mixed traffic. You don't need to have segregated cycling facilities. But as you step up through the speeds and then into different traffic levels, you need to provide more segregation, more protection for those road users. So I really like that because it's a good data approach. So one thing that LTM 120 in this diagram says in particular, these protected spaces encourage cycling, but light segregation may only be appropriate in certain locations. And of course, if you've got lower speeds, then if you can lower speeds and you can lower traffic flows, then that's going to be a quick win as well. But then of course you've got to take into account the fact that roads are for cars as well as bicycles. Now, the important point is the last one that's on there as well, is that the same requirement applies to high-speed rural roads. And I think this is something that has been missed out a little bit. There's been a lot of focus on active travel in and around 20, 30, 40 mile an hour limits. But, even this diagram, barely goes down into the, the higher speed roads in there. And I'm going to show an example of another way of analysing risk and danger posed to cyclists on rural roads in a second. So yeah, that's one example in the UK that's come from an active travel mindset, thinking about how we can encourage safe cycling and encourage cycling in general. The other way of looking at it is by using an approach that's been recently released by IRAP. So this is Cycle Wrap from IRAP. So I'm sure many of you that have been on our webinars will be aware of IRAP and the IRAP methodology. This is a really good cycle wrap demonstrator. Just Google cycle wrap demonstrator, and they've got a Power BI dashboard there where you can put in lots of different road features. So that's the central section that you can see in there, and there's just toggles on and off. So you've got lots of different road features. So you can code up an individual road, just as an example road there, and choose the level of segregation that's on there, how many carriageways are there. If you see the bottom right hand corner, it talks about that AAD figure and the road operating speeds, and unsurprisingly they're the ones that make the biggest impact on those figures that are on the right hand side. So what I did before this webinar is I coded up a typical 30 mile per hour urban road with no particular facilities for road users. So we've got 50 kilometers an hour, so it's in kmh operating speed there, and we've got 5,000 AADTs, and that's a reasonably busy urban road there. And then you can see the different risk factors on the right hand side there. So, I mean, bicycle versus bicycle, bicycle versus pedestrian, single bicycle crash risk, not particularly high, but, you look at that vehicle versus bicycle risk and it's right up there. And it's amazing what happens if you just change one variable. So the one thing that I did here was put in place a multi-use path. So that means a shared use path that can be used by cyclists and pedestrians. So you can see immediately that vehicle versus bicycle score has reduced dramatically. There's still the bicycle versus pedestrian risk there, and thinking back to LTM 120, it would suggest that this kind of infrastructure is only suitable where you've got low pedestrian flows. Otherwise you may want some of the different kinds of infrastructure. But it shows that how quickly you can change the risk posed to road users just by putting in a single infrastructure, single piece of infrastructure. Now, I said I'd talk about rural roads there as well. This is what the scoring starts to look like for a typical rural single carriageway road, maybe with some bends present on it. And you can see that vehicle versus bicycle score goes through the roof. Sorry, a score of well over 500. So we were worried about the score of 70, I think, on the slide but one previously. This is showing how much risk is posed by having on-road cyclists with vehicles traveling speeds of 50 miles an hour and possibly even faster than that. So I said that a lot of the focus on active travel has been about urban areas, and it hasn't really looked into rural areas as much. And there's a really great debate to be had about there in the future about how we can have safer rural cycling. Now, I mentioned, urban areas. So this is a tool that we've created in the past that we've mentioned on a couple of webinars previously, the Active Streets Assessment tool. And what it does is it takes that LTM 120 diagram and just by simply clicking on a few buttons allows you to see where those roads are. So on the left hand side, you can see the roads that according to the data and in that matrix, the ones that would need to have some kind of segregated cycle provision. Then the ones in the middle, where it's suitable for just some form of on-road cycling lane, possibly using a painted cycle lane. And then mixed traffic is the rest of the roads on the right. And yeah, it is the majority of roads that are suitable for mixed traffic, because on the majority of our roads we have low traffic flows. So I just wanted to show you a few things that we've created in the Active Streets Assessment tool recently, because we have made a few changes, I think, since we last featured it onto a webinar. So yeah, we've got a few more data layers in there, so you can have a look at different base maps, etc. And then you can go and click on an individual link and see the same kinds of information. So again, this is using the Bracknell Forest example, which anybody can get access to. I'm sure we can put some log on details in the chat if anybody wants to access this and explore around. So you can see the speed data, you can see the collision data. So actually at this spot, there have been 2 pedal cyclist collisions, but we've also added in a link to Google Street View, which is really handy because when you're looking around the data, you're looking around on the map, you really need to see that picture. So there we go. So that's a junction in the distance that people are queuing up for, and you can see that the kind of infrastructure. Long straight road would sometimes encourage quite high speeds, but it does appear that there might be a shared use path just to the side there. So the other thing that we've got in Active Streets Assessment tool that we're trialing out now, so with some of our friends from C-Sense, who you may remember from the Joining the Dots conference, after that we got talking to them about using some of their data. So what we're looking at doing now in some sample areas, so looking at this in Birmingham, for example, is can we get information in from their connected bike lights to tell us more about what's happening on the road network? So we've got average speeds of bicycles on there. So the bicycles that have the lights, you can see what the average speeds of the bikes are there. You can see what the count is. So you can see which roads tend to be used more frequently by cyclists in those areas. We've got some swerving data there as well. So it's got those gyroscopes in there that detect whether the cyclists are swerving. We've then got a surface quality metric. So you'd hope that cyclists will avoid the worst of the potholes, but general bumpiness is there. And then also whether there's any harsh braking. And of course, because it's the Active Streets Assessment tool, you can then look at all of the other variables that are associated with it. And then when you scroll down to the bottom, we've got some of that C-Sense sample data in there. And then, yeah, this is where the Street View link comes in really handy as well. You can just click on that and you can see, for example, on this road, well, okay, well, when Google drove up and down there, it was quite congested, which might explain some of the harsh braking that was happening along there. But yeah, so again, that's something else that we've added in there recently too. And the final thing that really is just quite hot off the press is to help people with schools travel planning. So one of the tools you may be aware of is the ability to have a look at walking distances. So we've now put in an isochrone system, so you can see average walking distances from any individual point. Now, these are banded in 10-minute sections, but you can change the way that works, so it's in 2 5-minute bands, etc. So you can see from any individual school what the average walking distance is, which means that when you add that in with all of the other data that we've got available within ASSAT, it really is becoming an even bigger and better tool than it was before. So that was a bit of a plug for ASSAT. What I'm going to do now is I'm going to hand over to Suzanne, who's going to talk about a project that we did with the local authority who wanted to use all of this data in some active travel planning.
Great, thank you, Richard. Afternoon, everyone. Yeah, so as Richard said, I'm just going to give you a bit of a talk through some work that we did for West Berkshire. So previously for West Berkshire, SOMO, a behavioural science consultancy, had done some research into parental barriers to children's independent travel. And they'd identified 4 key transport-related barriers, these being sort of fears over speeding traffic, busy roads, the risk of collision, and whether there was any pedestrian and cycle facilities available. So using these as a framework, we can pull together a variety of data to give insight into active travel in an area that offers evidence with which to maybe challenge these barriers or identify areas for improvement and ultimately encourage greater walking and cycling. So the following examples do focus on school-related active travel, but really it could apply and be used in relation to any type of active travel. So let's see how the data can help. Next slide, please, Richard. So the first thing that we really need to understand is to have an idea of the routes that pupils might be taking to get to and from school. There may of course be exceptions where pupils wish to walk with their mates, and so they'll take a longer route to go via a friend's house. But by using pupil postcode data and a routing engine, we can identify favoured active travel routes between their homes and the school, shown here by the darker purple lines. And these will include non-traffic routes as well as roads if they all offer a shorter route between the start and end point. So thinking back to those 4 barriers, speed data is the first one. That can be used to understand the extent of non-compliance against the posted speed limit, shown here an extract from our speed compliance tool. And we can use that just to understand just how much speeding there might be around a school or on those routes being used by the pupils as they travel to schools. Secondly, we can get model traffic volumes, which can show just how busy roads around schools might be. Next, please, Rich. And we can identify those routes where traffic volumes are high and conversely those routes where traffic volumes are low and therefore on which active travel may be promoted. Again, this data is available through the speed compliance tool. Thirdly, parents were found to often cite reference to collisions that they were aware of having happened on routes and associate that with a fear of risk. So by looking at Stats 19 data, we can identify collisions within a radius of the school that have involved child pedestrians or pedal cyclists, just to quantify what that risk based on known injury collisions really is. And Richard's mentioned ASAT and the data this holds, which can offer extra over insight into residents' likelihood to be active. Using the mosaic socio-demographic data of communities across an area, we can understand the level of bike ownership, shown here in the green, and which obviously without access to a bike, cycling is obviously very difficult, and also the likelihood for communities to engage in exercise. So the little excerpt there from ASAT in red shows the level of no exercise, so propensity to exercise. These 2 data sets often have an inverse relationship and can show where pupils come from communities in which active travel is more likely to be adopted, and versus those where it isn't. And finally, the 4th barrier to independent travel was related to the presence of pedestrian and cycle facilities. So Richard has just shown us a demonstration of the cycle wrap. Road Safety Foundation and IRAP have also developed the active travel tool that can be used to examine what the level of inbuilt safety is for a stretch of road for pedestrians and cyclists. And it's based on a star rating and a level of stress pedestrians and cyclists might be exposed to when using facilities. So here we can see the assessment outcomes of a route used by those travelling to or from this local school. The existing footways on either side of the road have been attributed a 4-star rating and a moderate level of stress that most adults are able to cope with. And this tool, and then on the right-hand side, we can see the star rating and level of stress associated with different types of pedestrian crossings. So we can use this tool to either guide decisions on new facilities, or we can use it to understand the star rating given to existing crossing facilities. So in this example, there's a Pelican crossing just to the north of the assessment area, and we can see that that has been given a 5-star rating and a moderate level of stress. And here's another example of the data that's been collated in relation to a secondary school. So as we can see from the routing map, we have a much larger pupil residency area, but quite a dominant north-south route to and from the school. And again, using the speed compliance tool, Stats 19 data and census data, we can understand what the average speeds are, what the traffic volumes are, whether there have indeed been any pedestrian and pedal cyclist collisions on any of those routes, and understand sort of that likelihood of residents engaging in active travel can be. And just to show you there, we can do infrastructure assessments on different parts of the pupil's route to school. So on the left, we've got an area immediately outside the school. It falls within a 20-mile-an-hour zone, and this is reflected in the high star ratings and low stress attributed to both pedestrian footways and pedestrian crossing facilities, even the informal crossing points, which reiterates the importance of speed and reducing risk to vulnerable road users. And the second area on the right-hand side, which is slightly further away from the school, it's beyond the 20-mile-an-hour zone and encompasses a busy A road, where pedestrian footway scores are much lower and the different pedestrian crossing types present a range of risk levels shown by the varying star ratings and differing levels of traffic stress on the right-hand side. So as well as using a variety of data and the active travel tool to understand the level of risk pedestrians and cyclists are exposed to when walking or cycling, it can also be used to identify sites for potential infrastructure improvements. So here we have a community centre to the south, shown by the green dot, and it's used as a park and stride for the local infant school. And we've got here the identified route to the school. An assessment of key points along the route where pedestrians have to cross the road highlights an informal crossing point that, using the active travel tool, gets a 4-star rating and a high level of traffic stress for those using it. By using data on existing speeds, we can identify opportunities to improve the rating. In this example, adjusting the criteria in the active travel tool to reflect a potential speed limit of 20 miles an hour and operating speeds of 25 miles an hour improves the star rating for all crossing types to 5-star. Next, please, Rich.
Yeah, it seems to have disappeared off the slide deck. The next image. But I think that was you done, wasn't it? Was that the last one?
It was, yeah. So it was just yeah. So so what has disappeared is the images we've seen before, the different types of pedestrian crossings, all of which have been given a 5-star rating and lower levels of traffic stress.
Yeah. So
as a result of changing that parameter.
Yeah, I managed to drag it out, but for some reason, Microsoft Teams isn't showing it in the final slide. So it's there, I can see it, and I've put it in the chat. I put it in the chat so everybody can see, 5 green stars all the way through the list. So yeah.
Yeah. So hopefully that's given you a flavour of and perhaps some ideas on how you can use the data to encourage more active travel and, where necessary, deliver improvements on identified routes to help encourage more walking and cycling.
Fantastic. Thank you both. That was, something of a sort of whistle-stop tour and quite a lot of stuff that you alighted on there. We obviously have a sort of nervous audience today who haven't been anxious enough yet to drop any questions in the chat, but I've certainly got plenty of questions I'd quite like to ask. So please do stick your questions in the chat, and that will prevent me from basically hogging the limelight for the remainder of this time. And I'm going to come to Sam Scott's question in a moment, which is under the Q&A panel. Don't worry, I will check both the chat and the Q&A. So wherever you put your questions, I'll make sure that they get put to the presenters. The first thing I guess I was going to ask, which was just a very sort of practical question, is around access to some of the tools that you've talked about. So we've shared in the chat some login details for the Active Streets Assessment tool, which obviously is a bit of a sort of proprietary thing, but some of the demonstrator tools, particularly from IRAP, how do people access those? Are those links that we can drop out to people and they can have a play with for themselves, or do they need to be part of a sort of broader IRAP program?
No, absolutely. Access to the active travel tool is free and available to anyone. So there was the link on one of the slides. So Steve, perhaps you could drop that into the chat for me. You can just go onto that. You do need to register, but it's entirely free. And there's a really useful sort of information user guide associated with it. I mean, it is very straightforward. So yeah, people can go in there, have a play, select a site that they're familiar with, and see what results come out.
Great, thanks. Rich, I wonder whether I could ask you perhaps a slightly sort of more challenging question about the stuff that you started with right at the top, which was around risk, danger, and perceptions of safety. And we know that those are all important things. But I guess when we come from a sort of safety background, we've maybe had a certain set of thresholds in mind. I can think of schemes that we've had to make decisions on in the past where, quite frankly, you've had to have a certain number of casualties before it would be justifiable for the schemes ahead. But what you were sort of pushing at was that the thresholds are different when you're thinking about active travel because the policy goals are a bit different. I just wondered whether you could kind of zone in on that a little bit about just how different the thinking needs to be, and I guess how that sort of does fit with a more safe system view of the road network.
Yeah, I think it's interesting where this view has come from. So it's something that I started hearing perhaps 8 years, 9 years ago, something like that. And it wasn't necessarily from the traditional road safety professionals. It was from campaigners, from cycling campaign groups, from people who wanted to make their neighborhoods safe, who were starting to talk about how they felt about using roads. And that's a really tricky thing for many of us to engage with, thinking about people's feelings. We're used to working with data, which is a lot easier. But thinking about people's feelings and people's perceptions about safety, you go, well, the evidence says that there's no risk there. But then somebody gave me a really great example when I was at a conference, and they were talking about a road, and they were saying, and they gave me an example of a road. They said, it's got the best safety record ever. There's been no cyclists killed on there or seriously injured in the last 10 years. Because it's terrifying, and no cyclist in their right mind would cycle down that road. And when you start to think about it from that perspective, you're missing out on some information about road danger there. So you've got people's thoughts and feelings about what is a dangerous road, and they can tell you that. They don't need to look at the data to tell you what a dangerous road is, but that doesn't necessarily turn up in the statistics. So what you do need to do is you need to think about it almost from that IRAP, road infrastructure approach, whichever assessment it is that you use, to identify, the road features that are not safe. And I think that's what the active travel guidance is happening at the moment. It's looking at this from a danger perspective. It's not saying you need to wait for the collisions to happen, but it is saying that, there are certain key things that we know about traffic speeds and around how vehicles mix with each other. That means that they will not be safe for cycling. So I think when you start to think of it from the perspective of the road user a little bit more, and the policymakers start thinking about that too, that's when we get this change.
And just thinking about how the quantifiable that is. Obviously, you can do questionnaires and you can develop quantitative data around something like perceptions of safety. Is it feasible for us to take what we know about perceptions of safety and effectively calculate it based on a whole bunch of some of the empirical data that you've been looking at here? So where we get congestion that looks like X, and we get traffic flow that looks like Y, and we get speeds that look like Z, then actually road users don't like roads that create that environment. I mean, I guess in some senses that's what LTM 120 has been trying to address. But does the research kind of connect to the data in that way?
It's an interesting one. I think this is the problem with these multifactorial analysis. As soon as you've got two variables in the mix, how do you choose which one? How do you change which one you do, unless you come up with some really well-designed experiments? We're throwing several dozen factors into the mix here. So how do you figure out which ones are having the impact on road danger and road risk, and which are the ones that have impacts on perception? And actually, there was a study that we did for Transport for London a few years ago that tried to look at this kind of approach that would, use some reasonably complex mathematical models. But the idea is that it would produce something at the end of it that would say that these are the key attributes. And if in these kinds of areas, on these kinds of roads, you change these things, this is likely to be the impact on that risk to road users, and therefore the danger. And I think, if you've got that link to the danger, then that's, there's a very straight line, I think, to that between, danger and perceptions, because, road users know what is inherently dangerous. They're not always wrong about that. And you can see that in the choices that they make on where they walk and where they cycle, etc.
And I guess, Suzanne, in some senses, that's kind of what's coming out in the stress score that you presented. Tell us a little bit more about those and what they might indicate about the suitability of the environment for different road users.
Yes, absolutely. The active travel tool is a really good way of understanding sort of what factors are influencing that risk factor in terms of the star rating. Because by changing criteria in the tool, then you can see what impacts it's having on the star rating and the level of traffic stress. The level of traffic stress is is based on some research by the Mineta Transportation Institute, and it categorises 4 different levels of traffic stress. The lowest is considered suitable for everyone, including children, and then moves right the way up to sort of the top 2 categories, which is considered the level of stress that only the strong and fearless group will tolerate. So yeah, that's the sort of the range that it's encompassing. And as I say, by changing the criteria within the tool, you can really have a play around what changes you might be able to influence on the ground, and see what impact that has in terms of that perception and level of danger.
I'm actually, Suzanne, oh, sorry, I just wanted to pick up on something, if that's all right, Dan. So, at the beginning of your presentation, you talked about the barriers that people saw there, but a lot of the analysis that you were doing tended to show that they were reasonably safe crossing points, and the streets were safe there. Do you think that there is a misconception about the level of danger and risk posed to individual roads, and can this tool actually help and dispel some of those thoughts?
Yeah, certainly. So having done the work for West Berkshire and looked at 10 different schools in the area, then there was very little evidence of sort of excessive speeding in the vicinity of schools, really high traffic volumes, and few collisions. I mean, many of us will be aware that actually, despite the perception that there are very few injury collisions, I mean, happening just outside schools. And yeah, there a number of places there were already existing crossings that were available for the pupils to use on their routes to and from school, and those crossings provided benefit in terms of the reducing that level of risk. And so I think probably more than anything, then the evidence is there to help dispel those myths and those perceptions about those barriers to independent travel, and actually try and break them down with informed evidence, and thereby encouraging more active travel. But where there are opportunities to improve the infrastructure and to dispel any evidenced areas of risk, then the opportunity is there to identify them through using the active travel tool.
So I was going to bring in Sam's question, which actually was on where we kind of got to, which is that within the active travel tool, you're disaggregating the infrastructure that is suitable for children or people with needs, etc., through to I think you described infrastructure that be suitable for the brave, something like that. And Sam said different types of cycle infrastructure will appeal to different segments of cyclists. Competitive cyclists prefer on-road, whilst novice cyclists prefer more segregated infrastructure. How do we get the balance right from a behavioural perspective? And I guess what I was actually going to sort of append to that is there a kind of minimum standard that we should be looking for pretty much wherever?
Who do you want to answer that first?
I'm happy for either of you to have a stat.
Suzanne looked like she was drawing breath. No, you look like you were drawing breath there. Yeah, I think that if there is a minimum standard, it should be that that the speeds are appropriate for the type of use that we want. That's absolutely critical. So if we just gloss over the whole rural road and cycling debate there that I unearthed earlier on.
But don't worry, I'm going to come back to the rural roads piece. We'll discuss that some more.
It's a difficult one, that. But yeah, I think if we're talking about urban environments, there's been a huge shift towards 20. You saw what happened in the IRAP star ratings when I put in a segregated path. You didn't have to put in that segregated path. You just needed to lower the vehicle speeds. It would have had almost exactly the same result in there. So I think the minimum standard is, safe speeds where people are using those roads in significant numbers. And if you really need to have higher speeds, then you need to have better infrastructure.
Great. Did you want to add anything to that, Suzanne?
No. I think that was an excellent response.
Okay, well, let me come back to the rural roads question then. And I think this is something that you'll have something to contribute on, Suzanne, as you have quite recently worked on a big project about the different sorts of rural road networks that we have. And I guess What I was wondering about, listening to you both present is where the argument might go from a sort of safety perspective about cycling on rural networks, because if we can't lower the speeds, then actually we're talking about levels of risk that are just unsustainable. But maybe there are parts of the network where we don't want to lower the speeds. I mean, we do that on, for instance, on our motorways. We determine that they're built to a certain safety standard, but they are really only for certain types of mode to use. Do we need to go down the same sort of approach with rural roads, or do we need to adopt a more user-centric sort of message? Just interested in your.
So without wanting to give away too much, because obviously the rural roads is the subject of our 4th webinar in this series, the sort of the output that Richard showed from the cycle wrap, based on a typical winding road, does match the findings that we had when we worked on a project for the RSE Foundation to develop a taxonomy for rural roads. And those types of rural roads that are sort of quite narrow, winding, sort of the typical type of road that you might see cyclists on. Unfortunately, that was where we saw the greatest number of or proportion of cyclist injury collisions, compared to other rural roads, like your sort of more major A roads that travelling through non-built up areas, therefore are deemed rural. So yeah, so unfortunately there is evidence in terms of the Stats 19 to verify then what Rich is identifying through the cycle wrap. So yeah, it'll be an interesting one just to see what could be done, and I know we're hoping to do some more work in this area, and sort of see how the findings go. And yeah, personally, I'm not sure I can imagine at this stage sort of segregated cycle facilities along a narrow winding country lane, but yeah, as I say, the evidence unfortunately is there to verify what Rich has identified in the cycle wrap, which is it's good. That sort of gives further evidence to backing up the cycle wrap, but yeah, I'm not quite sure how we go about it in terms of addressing that risk in the future.
Yeah, I'm not surprised you've given that answer, because it's a really thorny subject, and I suppose it's one that I've only thought about more recently when I've been starting to think about Vision Zero and how on earth you meet that objective, and the kinds of scenarios that are just going to be really difficult to address. So I was on a call with Nick Chamberlain, the policy manager at British Cycling, I think it was last autumn, and we ended up in a group talking about this kind of problem that we have. So he's from British Cycling. That's competitive cycling, it's leisure cycling, it's on the road. When you've got cyclists that use those kinds of roads, and you've got vehicles traveling at high speeds, the consequences of any kind of collision are going to be death or serious injury. It's as simple as that. So do we permit this kind of activity to take place? You mentioned building off-road cycle networks on rural roads. That's clearly not going to happen. I know there are countries that have achieved that. I know that if you go into mainland Europe, there is a much bigger extensive provision on that. And it would be great to be able to see that. At the moment, we have quiet cycle lanes, which is good if you can reduce speeds and reduce traffic volume. Sustrans do an incredible amount of work on there, but it's not really the cross-country interurban network to encourage that more long-distance cycling that's required. But we do have this problem of effectively leisure cycling, and I say the problem, and I mean it from a safe system perspective, because you've got that conflict that happens there. Actually, I think if you look at the statistics, the leisure cycling, the weekend cycling, probably isn't contributing that much in terms of the numbers compared to the people that are doing it for more utility purposes. It's the same kind of thing when you have a look at motorcycling as well. If you look at weekend motorcycling casualties, then actually not really any higher on a Saturday or a Sunday than they are on a weekday. It's one of those, you know, I would say built-in myths, built-in preconceptions that we have in the road safety sector. And actually, you know, rural cycling has some of the same issues in terms of safe system and inherent risk that we have with motorcycling on the same networks, because when you have people who aren't in those big metal boxes coming off or being hit at those speeds, the outcomes are not positive, and trying to figure the solution for that is going to be tricky, but it's a great debate for us to be having.
Well, let me just fold in Sam's other question that you raised, which is about rate-based targets for, well, he was talking about active travel uptake. I guess what I was going to go with it was, you know, what you're indicating is that we need to be thinking much more about understanding what the data can tell us on a almost sort of segment by segment basis, link by link basis, so that we make a network that is appropriate and resilient to the types of road users that use it, and to the sort of policy outcomes that we're looking for. And I guess that brings us back to the data, really, which is, you know, have we got the data to provide good quality rate-based indices on a link-by-link basis? And what else do we still need in order to be genuinely informed about the kinds of policy goals that we've got for our road networks?
Wow, I mean, I can have a go at that one if you like, Suzanne. I mean, it does lead in a little bit to the webinar that we're running next week on safety performance indicators. We've been looking at that from very much a road danger reduction perspective and safe system, and saying what other information do we need to know about the roads to help understand how dangerous they are and what the dangers that are posed. I think, you know, on a link by link basis, you're always going to run into the problem of relatively small sample sizes with a lot of these things. The thing that I'm considering at the moment is, you know, area-based approaches. If you can summarize an area, so if you could provide a score for a town or a city or a village, even in terms of active travel, you know, you can aggregate data there and then give it some kind of score. And you can definitely do that with the data that's out there. It's not something that we presented on that area-wide basis, but it would definitely align with a lot of Active Travel England's guidelines that they have there.
Fantastic.
I guess just to follow up with that, sorry, Dan, is the availability of data is improving, as you say, Richard. Then there is the challenge of sample size in some places, but still in many areas there isn't the data available, particularly around cycling. And we've got sort of improving access to reliable traffic data to give ratios of for vehicle users, but for those active travel users, then unfortunately in some areas still that data is quite a big gap in that data.
Which leads quite nicely into another question that I wanted to throw out, which was around the work that you've done on isochrones. So you haven't got probe data or sensor data, or, you know, some sort of quantitative data source that tells you exactly what's happening on the road network, then are there ways in which you can infer, and using some of the data layers that are in ASP might be reasonable ways of doing that? I guess what I was wondering is, you know, sort of other uses that some of that kind of inferred data might be put to. So you demonstrated, Rich, an example around schools, but could it also be done around things like modal intersections, bus stops? Could it be done around restaurants and cafes? Could it be done about employment locations, workplaces? You know, I guess there's quite a lot more that you could do with that sort of data than is currently being done.
I think it'd be interesting if this kind of data and information was opened up much more publicly in an accessible format. And I don't mean, you know, giving everybody in the country access to the active streets assessment tool, but, you know, as kind of a nudge factor. You know, so if you use, you know, your mobile phone and you're planning out a journey or something, and you say, I want to go to Sainsbury's or Tesco or other supermarkets are available. You can click on there and it tells you that it's a 5-minute drive. But what if it told you that, you know, it's actually only an 8-minute walk? Something like that, and you know, this is the cost saving that you may have. Yeah, there's those kind of nudge factors that could be included within applications like that. So yeah, having data available in an accessible format to members of the public, I think would be really great.
And I mean, so that current thing we talked about, walking times, and you know, you talked about the sort of the nudges. I was wondering whether there are any other behavioural applications that we could see drawing on the kinds of intelligence that you talked about. So when you were talking, Suzanne, about bicycle ownership and some of those social data sets that are there, I mean, presumably that could be used for things like locations of hire schemes, or indeed promotion of bike loan schemes by authorities in order to encourage uptake of more active modes.
Yeah, absolutely. So the examples that I was giving earlier focus very much on school-related travel, but as I said, they could really be the same methodology could be used and applied to any sort of focal point. So that could be a business. So if someone's out there and working to develop travel plans with local employers, then very much the same sort of data sets could be used to understand just what the concerns are with traffic sort of patterns around that employment area, either a single business or perhaps an industrial estate, and look at routes in and out of that area, pedestrian and cycle routes in and out of that area, and understand then where I don't know, Section 106 funding, for example, could be used to improve the infrastructure and encourage more walking and cycling, so particularly if you've got some new development within that zone that you can tap into.
That's a really helpful thought, and again, it sort of ties back to some of what we were talking about earlier, which is the way in which we need to think in a more integrated fashion. So think about where the money could come from, think about how it can deliver multiple benefits at the same time in order to deliver on the variety of policy objectives that we've got. So look, we are nearly up with our hour, so I'm going to start to draw the conversation to a close there. If you've got any questions that you would like to fire in, you know where to find us via the Agilicis website, or contact any of us via sort of social channels, etc. Do make sure too that you are registered for the rest of the series. So we've got 3 more of these masterclass sessions, as we've already mentioned. The next one next week is on safety performance indicators. So I think, you know, maybe if you've had a little too much PIMS because you were at a street party on the Monday, make sure you've got a little oasis in your Tuesday afternoon at 2 o'clock. Come and join us for the next webinar, and it will be about safety performance indicators. And I'm sure alcohol-related risk will be covered as a part of that.
Can I drink PIMS on it, Dan?
You come with whatever beverage you would like to bring to the session, and that goes for anyone who's off camera as well. So hopefully that's been useful. Hopefully you found there's been some things that you take away from that, and we look forward to seeing you again on another webinar soon. But for now, stay safe out there and see you shortly.